Hello, it looks like everybody is still hopping in, so we'll give them a couple minutes to get on their Zooms. Okay, looks like we are getting a nice group of people joining us. Thank you all for joining our virtual Coffee with a Crim analyst. Today, our DNA analyst, Nancy Dinh, will be discussing challenges of working with physical evidence in cold cases and post-conviction casework. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat box and stick around for the Q&A at the end of her presentation, and we'll make sure everybody's questions get answered. Thank you. Nancy, whenever you're ready.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I'm actually going to turn my camera off as I have the slideshow going. I just don't want it to be distracting. I have a lot of facial expressions that I tend to make, so it can be very distracting. So hang on one second. So, Cindy, is the slideshow showing, or is it just my PowerPoint screen?
It's your PowerPoint screen. So if you want to go to start from the beginning,
Okay.
there you go.
So there? All right.
Yep.
Great. Um, so let me go ahead and shut my camera off. Let's see. There we go. So good morning, everyone, again. For those of you who are still joining us, I hope you do have a nice warm cup of coffee with you. Um, so welcome to the first installment of Coffee with a Criminalist DNA edition. Here at Forensic Analytical Crime Lab, thank you all for joining us. This presentation is titled Jumpstart Your Cold Case, and it's the first of several chapters in this mini-series. And so the main focus of the cold case DNA series is to provide tips from a DNA analyst perspective for how to best prepare yourself to talk to a DNA analyst about your case and what to expect once DNA testing is underway. So, this first chapter will cover what you'll ideally want to know before reaching out to a DNA expert. So some of this information may seem painfully obvious and simple, but this content is derived from my own experience working with clients. It's not meant to be disparaging to anyone we've worked with before, but rather should be seen as more of like a learning experience for the both of us. So firstly, who am I and how am I qualified to talk to you about cold case DNA work? So, as Cindy introduced me earlier, my name is Nancy Dinh. I'm a senior forensic scientist here at Forensic Analytical Crime Lab, aka FACL. I've been here for about 10 years, and during that time, I've worked on numerous cases with old evidence, whether it be cold cases or post-conviction cases, in both consultation and DNA testing capacities. So FACL has worked on hundreds of cases as a company with old evidence, and we found success in both cold and post-conviction casework since the mid-80s. So we've been around for a while. Um, we currently provide services for law enforcement, defense, and private agencies, which means our work spans pretrial cases, post-conviction cases, and cold cases. So Is there really any difference between the evidence in cold cases and post-conviction cases when it comes to DNA testing? The answer is, for the most part, no, because cold cases are unsolved cases with no charged suspects and whose investigative leads have gone cold, and they're now awaiting new evidence. Cold cases typically involve old evidence. Post-conviction cases are quote unquote solved cases that also typically involve old evidence. But as we know, post-conviction cases are those where individuals who have been convicted of a crime are claiming innocence. They've obtained representation and they have their attorneys review their cases in hopes of proving that they didn't commit the crime. So is there a difference? For us as DNA analysts, no. We objectively examine evidence in every case in the same exact way, depending on the context and the purported significance to the crime. And at the end of the day, evidence is evidence. So cold cases are generally investigated by the prosecution, and post-conviction cases are generally investigated by the defense. So although in more recent times, though, with the introduction of conviction integrity units and wrongful conviction units to some of the larger county DA offices, post-conviction cases have become more of a joint effort between the prosecution and the defense. So, what to know before talking to a DNA expert? As DNA experts who are going to either help you understand the work that has been previously done or who are going to help advise you on future testing potentials, we'll want you to know as much of this information on this screen as possible about your evidence. So these are all the key questions you'll want to attempt to answer. We'll dive more into each individual question in the following slides. Um, so the questions are, where was the evidence collected and by whom? When was it collected? Why was this item collected? Was the evidence previously tested? What is up with the evidence now? And who can we rule out? So, as gatekeepers of this information, we, as DNA analysts, hope that investigators can help shed light on as much of this information as possible so that we can all optimize our resources and hopefully streamline the process as much as we can. We don't want to keep stopping or backtracking or realize that we put time and energy into the wrong item of evidence. So before we begin to answer any questions about our evidence, we'll want to make sure we have our mise en place and are setting ourselves up for success. So part of that is keeping the facts organized. So create a comprehensive evidence list. I'm personally a fan of Excel spreadsheets. They're easy to organize and reorganize, easy visual, great shortcuts. Creating a list containing every evidence item and making notes as you answer those key questions will help not only you, but any experts and any future investigators with tracking the evidence in this case. So do the research to figure out the answers to the key questions, fill in the information, or check off the information in your table as you go, however you sort of design your table. Keep it organized so that it's super easy to reference when you need to, especially as you're building on it and strategizing with your team of experts. So the first key question that was on that list was, where was the evidence collected? It's important to know where the evidence was collected to establish probativeness, and also to understand agents which might impact the DNA interpretation of any of the results you get, such as whether or not this item is foreign to the scene. Like, was it an item that didn't belong to the victim that was found at the victim's house? What is foot traffic like in this area? Are there people we can account for as having handled or touched the item in question? Is this from the primary or secondary crime scene, etc.? So putting the evidence into context is incredibly helpful for your testing plan going forward. So keep track of the evidence, especially when there are multiple crime scenes. Make note of who collected the evidence. So if it's not obvious who collected the evidence from any police reports or reports in general that you have, maybe try chain of custody forms or packaging labels. So here's an example of a case summary that a client provided us. This case is a homicide that was investigated by Hawaii PD. It's not a cold case. It's just an example of what DNA experts look for when combing through the discovery that's provided to us. So, as I'm reading the summary, I make note of the evidence that was collected. Um, they're all highlighted here in yellow. I also make note of any other useful information, such as this. It says here that our evidence specialists used DNA-free powder to check for latent prints on the spent casing, which ended with negative results. So once this reveals at least one other person who may have handled the casing. So it's something to bear in mind when interpreting DNA results. A reference sample might be needed to be collected from this evidence specialist to rule them out or rule them in as a DNA contributor to that casing that they processed. So this summary as a whole does not tell me which officer or crime scene person collected these items. In this case, I can find this information on the evidence packaging. So once I get the DNA results, if I find that it might be useful to get an elimination sample from the officer or the evidence specialist, I'll request it from the client. However, it's not mandatory that a reference be provided. So if the DNA result were being submitted to, oh, say, a national database of convicted or unidentified offenders, aka CODIS, the CODIS lab just requires that we try to obtain any elimination reference samples, but it's not required that we actually get it. It's just better to clear up any potential issues before the profile is uploaded so that we can be as sure as we can be that the only probative DNA profiles are being uploaded to the database. So, in most instances these days, when law enforcement processes crime scenes, they're using gloves and taking extra precaution to preserve the integrity of the evidence. Part of that's because it has become general knowledge that DNA technology is super sensitive and can detect even a few cells worth of DNA. Back in the 80s and 90s, DNA technology wasn't as sensitive. So that fear of accidentally contaminating evidence wasn't as much of a concern, and wearing gloves and masks when collecting evidence also wasn't as commonplace. So that's why for any old cases with old evidence, especially, who handled the evidence is good information to have. So when was the evidence collected? Was it collected immediately after the alleged crime, 2 days after, 2 months after, 2 years after? Especially in the case of sex assault evidence we have here, the timing can be really crucial for the interpretation of the DNA results. So generally, the longer you wait, the more likely the evidence may be compromised. If it's been a couple days since the alleged crime, did an item go missing? Did anybody else handle any evidence at the scene after the crime and before collection? There will be more to flesh out as more time passes before collection of an item. So why was the item collected? Why was it probative then? Is it probative now? Is there anything that was collected and not tested, but might be of value to test now? Here's an example of a 1989 sex assault case wherein the probative items to test at the time are highlighted here in yellow. So as you can see, the DNA results here say that sperm and seminal material were identified in the vaginal samples. However, attempts to individualize the stains were not successful. So to FACL's knowledge, no other DNA reports were issued in this matter, meaning if these are the only DNA results associated to this case, then DNA was not helpful. FACL received this case during post-conviction. We decided with our client that based on the alleged events of the crime, these items that I highlighted here in pink appear to be the probative items. In examining the evidence, we found the vaginal, what was termed a body swab, were consumed. Only the swab sticks were left. The vaginal slide, which was created from the vaginal swab, still existed. However, the slide was not preserved well, so we couldn't get any DNA off of that either. So we had to explore the possibility of other evidence that we sort of categorized as probative, right, such as the anal swabs and pubic comb specimens, given the condition of the other items, the vaginal and the body swab, given the condition of those items that were previously tested. So the anal swabs and pubic comb specimens, these are both examples of items that were not previously tested, but are still probative and worth testing now. In the next chapter of this series, we'll go into more detail about different types of evidence and options for retesting or new DNA testing using real life case samples. So I do encourage you to tune in into the next episode of this. I promise it'll be a treat. So, was the item previously tested? You'll notice the reasoning behind most of these key questions overlap. So, there's going to be some repetition in my presentation, but that's not a bad thing. Um, so, was any type of forensic testing done in general? Other experts, such as pattern or fingerprint experts, firearm experts, medical examiners, toxicologists, they can all collect swabs from items or people for the purposes of DNA testing. So, seeing these testing reports can help identify who collected a sample and also, more importantly, what the sample is. So, for example, a firearm expert may collect a swab from a gun and call it gun swab. What does that mean? A deeper dive into the reports may reveal that the sample was of the trigger and grip, not necessarily the entire gun or the magazine. So that suggests there that there are more untested area of the gun that we can explore. So was any DNA testing done? We touched on this in the previous slide, but it's good to know what the findings were from previous tests and see if there's a need or possibility of revisiting that item for additional testing. So I say possibility because some samples might have been entirely consumed during previous testing, so there's no opportunity to revisit that sample. So where has the evidence been this whole time and what's up with it now? Um, To find out, you can gather all of your reports, investigative and scientific reports, and trace the movement of the evidence. So make sure you get the full picture as to where the evidence has been and what information's already been gathered from it. So sometimes it can be hard to track, especially for older cases where the documentation wasn't as well preserved. So here's an example of that. Um, I can hardly tell what the evidence item is, but hopefully there's some other record of this possible item number one collected somewhere else. Does the evidence still exist and where is it now? Excuse me, is it in the custody of the police, the court, or the lab? How is it stored? So storage conditions can give you insight into the possible condition of the evidence and even the quality, maybe even the quality of the DNA you might obtain from it. Now, these aren't objective conclusions that you would draw from learning about the storage conditions. These are just, uh, just bits of information that might be helpful when prioritizing or deprioritizing evidence in a case. Um, how much of the sample is left? If there was a blood stain on a shirt, was only a portion of it sampled before? Was all of it sampled before? In DNA reports, there's oftentimes a disposition section, which will tell you what happened to the sample after testing. So here is an example of the disposition section of a DNA report from a 1980 case. It's not super detailed, it just says hold for pickup. But maybe there's an additional record elsewhere of the evidence leaving this lab to go to its next spot. DNA reports and chain of custody reports from police departments usually record the movement of the evidence. It's just, in general, it's good to follow the evidence to each destination point, and that way you know you've accounted for all the reports and documentation related to the evidence. This next example gives you more useful information, such as the date that the evidence left the lab and who to. They also use a very unique way of describing the release of the item, which I like, which is the above listed items were relinquished to Detective Sergeant. Very interesting. This next example is also quite descriptive. It says all remaining DNA extracts, will be held in this laboratory's long-term frozen storage for a period of at least 5 years, and then will be released to the Glenn County Sheriff's Office or the BFS Chico Laboratory. So after those 5 years, hopefully there's documentation that tells you which agency, either the Sheriff's Office or BFS Chico, it goes to. But you can also contact those agencies on your own and figure it out. Hopefully it's all still there. This last example is very specific, but it's nice because it's clear to the reader which items were consumed, not consumed, so you know what's available for future testing. As a quick aside, you'll notice the last two dispositions make mention of DNA extracts. Sometimes we forget that DNA extracts are evidence too. So these are products of DNA testing that can be retested again if there's enough. You can choose to either test it again to try and get a better DNA profile, or you can use that remaining DNA extract for genetic genealogy. Um, with the availability of DNA extracts, you may not need to go back to the original item for resampling or retesting, and it's particularly advantageous when the original item no longer exists. Finally, the last key question you'll want to have the answer to before you contact a DNA expert is this: who can we rule out? An elimination sample is collected from a known source, and in the case of forensics, it's typically used to eliminate or take into account any individuals who might not be involved with the crime itself, but may be present on the evidence due to other circumstances. So, examples of elimination samples include consensual sex partners, the victim in a sex assault crime, a known user of a shared item, such as a vehicle, habitual user or wearer or owner of an item that was stolen or used in a crime, such as a knife that was taken out of a homeowner's knife block and used in a stabbing, and any other individuals who came into contact with the evidence after it became evidence, such as police officers, crime scene personnel, and lab personnel. All of these individuals whose DNA may be on an item of evidence for innocent or unrelated reasons can be taken into account when interpreting DNA results. So let's revisit those key questions once again, now that we've discussed them in greater detail. So again, those key questions are: where was the evidence collected and by whom? When was it collected? Why was this item collected? Was the evidence previously tested? What is up with the evidence now? And who can we rule out? I cannot stress how important it is to know your evidence. You are the leader, you are the quarterback, you're the head chef. Whatever analogy suits you best, your team relies on you to see the big picture and to communicate any useful information so they can assist you with getting the answers you need to hopefully solve your case. One last thing I want to mention now that you've answered your key questions is you're ready to speak to a DNA expert. Both you and the DNA expert will collaborate to come up with a game plan for testing. Speaking from experience, it is crucial that before you finalize any testing plan, you consider performing a fresh evidence inventory. So, evidence inventory meaning photographic documentation of what evidence there is today and the condition it's in today. So, pictures and notes from previous exams are usually helpful, but whether or not it's worth doing a brand new inventory of the evidence now that the case is in your hands sort of depends on how long ago previous testing was done and how confident you feel about what exactly the evidence might look like today. So, for example, I had this 1996 robbery case where the suspects reportedly left behind a pair of latex gloves at the crime scene, and there were notes describing the gloves, but I didn't see any photos. So, the client was interested in testing the gloves, so I suggested doing an inventory first before we finalize the testing plan. When I opened the gloves package, this is what I found. Well, there goes that. The latex had degraded in the last 25 years since the gloves were collected, so this really wasn't an option. The evidence inventory should be conducted by DNA analysts. Why? Because DNA analysts need to take pictures of the evidence anyway, so you'll be killing two birds with one stone, and there will be fewer hands in the pot, so as to reduce the risk of potential contamination. So I personally always recommend performing a fresh inventory because I like to put my own eyes on everything so I know what I have to work with. Some call it controlling, some call it having trust issues. I think I'm just being thorough. So you should encourage a DNA expert to take detailed photos and notes and organize them into a table for you so you can build on your own knowledge of the evidence. This is an example of a table I produced for a client. This table is a comprehensive collection of all the DNA work related to the evidence. So this includes notes from my own inventory, as well as DNA results or notes from previous exams. So once I complete the work on my end, I can expand this table further to include my results, And then it'll be super easy to compare testing results side by side to see what we can collectively conclude about the evidence. So now I'm going to jump into a case where complete evidence inventory played a crucial role in subsequent testing. So this case I'm about to discuss is a 1993 homicide sexual assault. The victim's body was found partially nude in a lake. This is out of Waukegan, Illinois. The victim's estranged husband was convicted of the crime. And due to the condition her body was found in, officials suspected possible sexual misconduct. A sex assault kit was collected from the victim for testing. As part of a request for post-conviction relief, the defense hired Fackel to re-examine and retest the evidence since initial rounds of DNA testing did not appear to be successful in identifying the possible perpetrator. So for a sex assault, most of the key questions are already answered. We know where the evidence was collected, why it was collected. This victim did not have any consensual partners, and her time of death was estimated to be a couple days prior to when her body was found. Was there previous testing? Yes, there was. So in 1993, the state lab conducted DNA testing on a portion of the vaginal, rectal, and oral swabs. You see here it says failed to reveal the presence of spermatozoa cells. So the state lab did not identify any semen when they looked at the samples under the microscope. If we have the disposition section, we see there was a request for pickup. Doesn't really tell us where the evidence went after that. And their bench notes were not available for this 1993 testing, so I couldn't try to retrace the evidence that way. In 2017, a private lab conducted the first round of post-conviction DNA testing. So this was after her estranged husband had been convicted of the crime already. So this private lab, they received all the evidence, and from the bench notes, I could see that they performed a pretty comprehensive evidence inventory, but without photos. So this is not how I would ideally want to organize my evidence list for easy reference, but to each their own. I see in their DNA report that they did receive the vaginal, oral, and rectal swabs, which I boxed here. So the assumption is that between 93 and 2017, the evidence was likely just in storage somewhere. So now I dig into the bench notes and I see this. It says swab box labeled in part O for oral contains 2 swab sticks and no swab material present. I see the same description for the vaginal and rectal swabs. So my thought now is that the swabs were consumed during the first round of testing in 93, right? But in 93, they only did a microscopic exam. So that sample should not have been consumed. But where else could it be? I asked the client if there was any other DNA testing done between 1993 and 2017, and they confirmed with me no. So I see this 2017 lab, they sampled about 50% of the staining in each box and processed that for DNA. So seeing their notes as it is, I know what to expect when we receive this case. Ultimately, in their report, they did not detect enough male DNA for further testing, so work was discontinued. So now we still don't have any answers from this sex assault kit. And we see in their disposition that the DNA extracts and the evidence were returned to the county clerk's office. They also state that additional items were received on October 20th, 2016 and inventoried but not processed. So I'm still trying to follow along with the evidence. It's not tracking so far, but maybe the 1993 lab really did consume all of the swabs. So come 2019, we received the case for a second round of post-conviction testing because as I said earlier, there weren't any answers from the sexual assault kit, and there may not be any answers, but historically we've generally been very good about being extra careful, extra thorough, extra meticulous. Not that other DNA analysts aren't, but there have been a lot of cases where we find information that previous labs did not. So here's the box the 2017 lab was referring to, that box that had the staining. Here's the inside of the box and the sticks. I expect the staining that I do see on the box is about 50% of the staining that was on there to begin with, like the 2017 lab said. So anyway, this is just a photo inventory. So at this point, I'm not sampling anything yet. I'm just taking photos so the client knows what is there. Um, so then I move on to the next batch of evidence. There are envelopes chock full of items in each envelope. And as I'm reading the outside of one of the envelopes, I see this coin envelope containing oral swabs, coin envelope containing vaginal swabs, rectal swabs. I'm like, that's interesting. So I open this package up, and this is what I find. Three envelopes contain the nearly intact oral, vaginal, and rectal swabs collected from the victim. For some reason, the swabs were separated from the boxes they were originally packaged in, but I learned over time that this practice of repackaging sex assault swabs was actually more common than one would imagine. I have no idea why this was a practice, but I'm sure there was a reason at the time. So looking at the writing on the package, I see that the annotations were made by an analyst in 2017, so from the 2017 lab. So that's kind of confusing because the work was done by the 2017 lab. So how did they miss this, right? So when I informed the client of this finding, they sent me an additional inventory spreadsheet created by the 2017 lab, and this is what I see on that spreadsheet. So the 2017 lab had the sex assault kit swabs in their possession all along, but they had two different analysts do the inventory and the DNA testing. So the inventory analyst repackaged the sex assault swabs. The DNA testing analyst had no idea and thought that all they had left were the boxes and broken swab sticks. So do you see why I have trust issues? So doing a fresh inventory and carefully tracking your evidence on a spreadsheet or in some other organized manner can eliminate any confusion and ensure that your records are accurate. Um, Inventorying your evidence and knowing exactly what you have to work with is so important. Um, I mean, do I have to pull up the photo of the completely disintegrated latex gloves again to stress my point? So, some rules of thumb that I've developed as an analyst who routinely examines evidence, uh, old evidence and evidence after another lab has. Fact check the reports because sometimes they really don't accurately reflect the state of the evidence. And if some of you return for the second chapter, you'll see they don't even always accurately reflect what DNA is truly present on the evidence. Double check the work. We're all human. We're prone to making mistakes and we're prone to missing things. I don't fault any particular analyst when I re-examine evidence and find things that previous analysts didn't. I think some of it is a function of the time. Like DNA technology is so much more sensitive now than it was back then. So we're looking at the evidence with a more modern and refined set of lenses now. And the possibilities for testing, especially with the advent of genetic genealogy, they seem boundless now. Question everything. It's okay to be skeptical about things, but of course, within reason. We can't reasonably test every surface of every single item or do every kind of DNA testing under the sun just because it's available. Resources such as personnel and funding are limited, so we really have to rely on the wit and the intuition of the experts we choose to be on our team to guide us to that solution. So that sort of concludes the actual presentation part of this presentation. Um, One attendee did pose a question beforehand, and I just want to make sure that I address it. It's loosely, I guess, related to everything we talked about. It is about, the work that we do and how, in what ways hiring a defense, well, we're not a defense expert per se, but hiring a DNA expert in general can be helpful in a case where, other lab has done work. So this question says, in the past, every DNA consultant I've retained has reviewed the prosecution's records and confirmed their findings. Is there any purpose served by having a defense retained consultant review the records? So I'd like to think this presentation introduced some ways in which DNA experts may review case files for, in ways in which DNA experts review case files and why it's useful for us to do so. Um, we review them also for possible retesting. The topic of this discussion is cold cases after all, and so part of, the case itself is unsolved. And so having an expert who has that experience comb through all of these older reports, I think could be really useful for figuring out how you should move forward or what type of work should be done going forward. Um, DNA experts can also use their expertise to review and interpret DNA results previously generated by other labs. So these interpretations extend beyond just the technical aspect of whether or not the testing done was proper or in line with the lab's procedures. We find that outside of the lab, we're often useful in the pretrial phase. Our practical experience, coupled with our knowledge of how DNA works, can assist clients with drafting up effective direct and cross-exam questions. Um, and that would just serve to ensure or help ensure, because we hope it doesn't happen, that there's no misinterpretation of DNA results in the courtroom. So thank you everyone for listening to this presentation. Simple as it may be, I hope that you all took away at least one thing from it. It is this sort of introductory chapter to this mini series. Please feel free to jot down my contact information. I've um, I've been given permission, limited though, to offer every attendee a free initial consultation. I'd be happy to take a look at a report and answer any quick questions you may have about the report or DNA in general. But obviously, any request beyond a report and a quick general consult will require us to enter into a contractual agreement and charge for the service. But honestly, it's my opinion that a DNA analyst could be the secret weapon you need to solve or defend your case. So, but just remember to come prepared with answers to those key questions before you call us. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nancy. Great job. I'll open up the chat to any questions. If anybody wants to hop on, you can just answer your question without having to type it in if you like. We have a couple minutes here for Nancy. And there she is. All right.
Someone left
Well,
instead.
I know, that's okay. Well, thank you all for coming. And this has been recorded. If you have anybody that you'd like to share this with, please let me know. Reach back out, and I'm happy to forward it along to your office, your group of colleagues. Um, Thank you very much.